Hello, everyone. In order to introduce the basic concepts of XML, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Gabriel Bodard, who's a reader in digital classics at the Institute of Classical Studies, School of Advanced Study, University of London. Gabby, tell us something about XML.
Great, thank you, Christopher. So yes, I'm going to talk specifically about the rules of XML, which is the language which is used to define many different XML languages, rather than talking about any one XML language such as TI or Epidoc or anything else. So these are very much the underlying ground rules. There are two kinds of rules for deciding whether XML is following the rules or not, and they are well-formedness. So well-formed XML follows the rules of XML, but not necessarily any particular language. And then there is validation to a schema, which, assuming something is well-formed, also then meets the specific rules of a particular language. And we'll show the differences between those in a minute. But the most basic thing to know about XML is that an XML file is a plain text file. It's a plain text file in Unicode. And so the characters in it can be Latin, or it can be any other script. It is not a binary format, as many file types are, or database types, Word documents, etc. are. You can open it in any kind of editor, in a text editor, a code editor, an XML editor, or whatever, and you will still see the same underlying plain text underneath it. The thing that gives this text structure and meaning are tags, and tags are any string of text that is delimited by angle brackets, where you have an opening angle bracket at the beginning of it and a closing angle bracket at the end of it. And so in the string you see on here, this angle bracket name angle bracket is a tag, and this angle bracket / name angle bracket at the end is another tag. Okay, this means that you cannot type an angle bracket in your XML file, meaning anything other than the beginning or end of a tag. So if you want to use an angle bracket to represent lesser than, for example, you need to escape that character. And to escape a character in XML, you use an entity which begins with the ampersand symbol and ends with a semicolon. And so you have entity LT and entity GT are lesser than and greater than for the opening and closing angle brackets respectively. And this also means that the ampersand character is also a special character in XML. And if you want to use an ampersand in your text, you have to escape it using this entity, the ampersand AMP semicolon. And you can escape any other character as well using entities. You can use a numerical entity such as this to represent any Unicode character you like. It's only particularly useful to do that with characters that you can't really type normally. It's not worth spelling an entire word out with entities, although one could if one wanted to. And you can also use entities to represent characters that it's not possible to enter using ordinary Unicode. The tags and the contents of those tags make up elements in XML. So an opening tag has the name of the element between the angle brackets, and the closing tag has the name of the element preceded by the / character. So an element is an opening tag and a closing tag. A special case is where you have an empty element, that is to say, the opening tag immediately followed by the closing tag with nothing in between. That can be represented, just to save space, as the opening tag with a / character at the end of the name, and is completely indistinguishable. So the empty element and the opening followed by closing tags will be treated in no circumstances differently in XML parsing or handling of any kind. The element, therefore, is made up of the opening tag, any of its content, the closing tag, plus optionally attributes. And an attribute is represented as you see here. There's a space after the name of the element or after the preceding attribute, as there can be multiple attributes, followed by the attribute name equals, and then the value in inverted commas. So an example of an element is given below. Coordinate type equals latitude, some content, and then the closing coordinate tag. Only the opening tag takes the attributes. Okay, so those are the parts of an element. One quick note is that if you have white space in your XML file, that is to say any space, tab, line break character, the presence or absence of white space is, of course, significant and meaningful. There is, as I just mentioned, always a space before the name of an attribute, and space separates words and various other things, as in normal text, and you want to keep that space in display. If you have a word, as given here in green, without a space in it, it is different from if that word has a space in it. Likewise, if you have a space before an attribute name, in the element opening tag, that marks it as an attribute. If you lack that space, then that is not treated as an attribute, and you have something which is nonsensical XML. And the element name p type followed by an equal sign is not a possible structure in XML. Likewise, the three sets of tags at the bottom of this slide, which look very similar, you're a sewer in a W tag, they have spaces in different places, and therefore they have different meanings. Those spaces, the presence of those spaces is significant. However, the type and amount of space is not significant. So XML will not, under any circumstances, differentiate between imp eritor with one space in there, or imp eritor with a line break in there, or between an attribute separated from its element name by a space, or an attribute separated from its element name by 20 spaces, or by tab characters, or new line characters and tabs and spaces, etc. Okay, so the type of space is not significant. This means that whenever you have a space in your XML, you can, if you want to, put in a new line there, or put in some tabs to indent it, or whatever, just for convenience of reading it, and it doesn't change the meaning. Okay, but you shouldn't put in a space or a new line where you wouldn't want there to be a space in the XML in normal circumstances. One last note about XML syntax is that you can add what are called comments, and these are any string of character that is preceded by this angle bracket, exclamation mark, dash, dash, and that is followed by dash, dash, close angle bracket. And then a comment will not be processed in your XML. You can use a comment to hide a piece of code. You can use a comment to comment out some code that is not well formed. Even it can have any kind of structure in there. Comments are very often used as a note to yourself or documentation to future users of your XML to read. It will not be processed by an XML parser in any way, and it doesn't have to validate. So here are the five rules of well-formedness for XML. XML has to follow these 5 rules in order to be XML. And that is that if you have any angle brackets or ampersand characters in your XML file, they must either be parts of tags or entities, or they must be escaped in order to be treated as anything other than that, using the entities as we showed in the first slide. Any tags that open must have a corresponding closing tag, with the one exception of those empty elements that I showed you that have the / after the name. Those elements contain no content, and therefore they're closed already. All elements must be wholly contained by anything that partially contains them. Okay, so if an element opens inside another element, it must close again before the parent element closes. Okay, that's the rule of nesting. So elements must be wholly contained by any ancestor element. A sort of follow-on from that rule is that the entire document must be contained by one element, which is called the root element. Okay, so an XML document is defined by having an opening tag at the very top and a closing tag at the very bottom, and that contains the entire document. So all XML files must be able to be reduced to this root node at the top of the document. And the last point is that attribute values, so the part in quotation marks in an attribute as part of an element name, may not contain any markup. So shouldn't contain angle brackets or ideally ampersands unless they're part of entities. And those are the absolutely essential rules. Those if it wasn't that you will have completely internalized these rules as soon as you start working on XML, because it will be very, very clear when you've broken them. I would suggest that you print out this slide and have it stuck to your pillow, so it's the last thing you see before you go to bed and the first thing you see when you wake up, because they're completely essential. You cannot do XML without knowing these 5 rules. You will know them by the end of this slideshow, and certainly by the time you start marking anything up in XML yourself. So just to test these rules, here is a piece of XML, a snippet of XML, which breaks at least one of those well-formedness rules. What I'd like you to do is pause this video now and unpause it when you know what the problem with this XML is. Okay. Okay, welcome back. So the error message you would get if you put this in your XML editor is that the element type paragraph must be terminated by the matching end tag /paragraph. And as you can see in here, the element paragraph that opens here is in fact followed by a closing tag page, because element paragraph needs to close inside the same element that it opens inside. Okay. Now the problem is that what we have here is what this XML is trying to represent, rather, is a feature that occurs in real data. Okay, you have a book that is the entire document. You have multiple pages inside that book, and you have multiple paragraphs inside them, but some of the paragraphs overlap between pages. That's completely to be expected. XML can't handle that in the way that this example is trying to do. There are alternative ways of representing that. One, you could close the paragraph at the end of every page and open a new paragraph on the next page. That's fine if all the paragraph markup does is starts a new line or puts a bit of space in between them. That doesn't break anything. But if you want to be able to count paragraphs, if you want to do something with marking text and his sentences and so forth, and reading the text, then this doesn't quite work. One way of doing that might be to mark that that one paragraph is only the beginning of a paragraph, and the first on the next page is only the end of a paragraph, and it's not technically a new paragraph. That would be a perfectly reasonable and perfectly well-formed way to represent this. Another way of representing this might be to say, well, pages are an arbitrary piece of information, and paragraphs are a really essential piece of information. So I'm going to tag the paragraphs completely, and I'm just going to mark the beginning of each page as an empty element, as a point in the text where something happens. And this is actually slightly more like the way we would handle this in most XML that handles this sort of content, but not for all features necessarily. But this would be fairly common, and you can number those pages if that was a useful part of the citation scheme, for example, of the document. Okay, here's 3 more snippets of XML, each of which breaks at least one of those rules of well-formedness. Again, pause the video now and come back when you think you know what's wrong with each of these. Okay, if for the first one, you identified that there was markup inside the attribute value which should not be there, then you were correct. This is the error message you would get, or something along these lines. For the second example, the string of characters angle bracket close angle bracket, which presumably is part of the transcription scheme of the document that is being edited here, is being treated as if it were an element. And it's saying this element has not been declared, and it's also not closed within its parent. You'd expect there to be a closing the element before the closing p element. That's not what you meant. So you'd obviously you'd escape those angle brackets, or you treat them as something else if you wanted to keep them in there. And in the third example, you'd get an error message saying that the entity Ruche has not been defined because it sees the ampersand and it thinks you're declaring an entity there. Whereas what in fact you want to either use the word and, or you want to use the ampersand entity to escape that. Okay, so those are basically the sorts of things which go wrong if you don't have well-formed XML. The second way you can handle the correctness or otherwise, you can define the correctness or otherwise of XML is with a schema, and that's the second concept of validation. A schema to which enables you to validate your XML defines a menu of available elements and attributes that you can use in your XML, and sometimes attribute values that are valid in particular places. It defines which elements and which content may appear in any given context, and it defines which elements and content sometimes must appear in a certain context. Okay, so some elements are not valid without certain attributes attached to them, and so forth. The value of this is that your XML editor, if you use an XML editor such as Oxygen or similar, will validate your XML file for you, and it will tell you anything that you have created that is not valid to your schema. You can have perfectly well-formed XML, but if it doesn't validate to the schema, it will give you that back as a message. The other thing that the schema allows your XML editor to do is to create a contextual menu of elements, attributes, or attribute values that are available to you at any point in the document. So if you go to the middle of a document and you type an opening angle bracket, it knows you're going to put in an element there, and it also knows that only these 10 elements would be valid there, so it gives you a menu of just those 10 elements and says you can know which of these elements is it you want, which saves you a lot of time, especially with a very large schema. So here again is another test. Here are a bunch of snippets of XML which are well formed but are invalid to a particular schema. Again, pause this video and come back when you think you know what is wrong with those 5 snippets of XML. Okay, welcome back. I'm sorry to say that that was a trick question. I hope that the answer you came up to with all 5 is that you don't know, because you're not a schema. You're not an XML editor. You don't have the epidoc schema to which these things are validating as invalid embedded in your brain the way your XML editor does. These are all well formed. Many of these would be perfectly valid in TEI, for example, which epidoc is a subset of, but would not be valid in epidoc. So we wouldn't expect you either now or possibly even later to know the answer to that question. And that's the real difference between well-formedness and validation. Well-formedness you need to know so that you don't create ill-formed XML at any point. Validation, your XML editor will take care of for you. You will, of course, learn lots of the rules as you go along for your particular schema, but you don't need to have them all learned by heart in the way that you do the well-formedness rules, which are much easier. And I said there were 2 ways of checking your XML is correct. One is to say, is it well formed? The second is to say, is it valid to a schema? And there is, of course, a third, which is it true? Have you marked up things correctly? Have you done things the way they are? Something can be well formed and valid and still completely false. But there's nothing we can do about that. The computer can't help you with that particularly. I mean, there are some ways that you can write, validating tools to check things are slightly more true. But if the word London turns up in the text and you tag this as this is a personal name when it's clearly a place name, that's just a mistake you've made or something you've deliberately done wrong. And there's nothing that XML validation can do for you about that. So one note just there, you can find these slides online at that URL, and you can also reuse them in almost any way you like. Check the Creative Commons license rules for that, just to be clear. Is there anything you'd want to add to that, Christopher?
I thought that was very thorough.
Okay, thank you.